Hello, it's Troy Francis here. Happy Saturday, or whatever day it is when you watch this. So I wanted to do something a little bit different today. This is a reaction video. I'm going to be reacting to Matt Walsh from the Daily Wire, who made a video a few days ago about marriage. Now, marriage has been a bit of a hot topic on Twitter or X in recent days and weeks, largely because a number of people in the so-called red pill space, not least Pearl of Just Pearly Things, or Pearl as her channel is now called, really pushing against the traditional conservative narrative that marriage is this wonderful institution and that every man should basically get married, and if he doesn't, he's not a real man, and so on and so forth. Now, let's get into the video in a second, so I'm not going to go into all of my takes on this, but I think suffice to say, legal marriage is clearly problematic. Legal marriage is, it's hardly worth the discussion. It's clearly problematic, particularly for men. And I believe there's a deeper problem with marriage, which is the problem of monogamy, because I think that human beings, maybe men in particular, but I think really both men and women, find long-term monogamy to be very difficult. I think we get quite bored. I think we like variety. We like the security. You know, we like having somebody to snuggle up with and drink hot chocolate and watch Netflix. But, you know, we also want a bit of variety. And so when you're writing a legal contract, which basically says, okay, I'm going to be with this one person for the next 50 years, and it's all legally signed off, and there are onerous penalties, certainly for the guy, if that doesn't end well, I think that's definitely something that we should be cautious about. But anyway, let's just get into this. We're going to have a listen to what Matt has to say, and we'll take it from there. Okay, so here we go, guys.
I've spent a lot of time in my career defending the institution of marriage, and I defend it because it's the bedrock of civilization, so it deserves defending, and I defend it because it's under constant attack, so it needs defending. And one of the most troubling developments in recent years, which we've discussed on the show in the past, is that these attacks...
This is obviously sped up slightly. He doesn't really talk this fast, but I needed to speed it up a little bit so it doesn't take 3 hours to do this.
Attacks are increasingly waged not just from the left, but from certain noisy segments of the right as well. Some right-wing influencers with legions of young, mostly male fans have decided that men should abandon marriage and family life and go their own way. These influencers, many of whom consider themselves...
Well, okay, so that's interesting at first, isn't it? Because he says that these influencers who have these legions of male fans, and I guess he's probably mainly talking about Pearl here, but I mean, in my own small way, you know, I've been talking about this stuff on my own account, and there are other people as well, you know, who definitely push back on the notion of traditional marriage. I mean, I would say the Tates, I think Fresh and Fit do to some extent. There's because, you know, the obvious reasons about the legal status of it. But he then says that these people are encouraging men to just go their own way. And I don't think that's quite what people are saying. I don't think that's quite what everybody's saying anyway. I certainly don't think Pearl, who I know because I've spent some time with and I've worked with her quite a lot, is somebody who would say that men should just go their own way. I don't believe that's her view. Again, I don't want to speak for her, but I don't think that's what she thinks. I think, like many people, she thinks that in an ideal world, if marriage worked as it was supposed to work, that would be great. It's just that currently, with the way the laws are and with the way things in society are, it doesn't really work as advertised. And that is the problem.
Themselves a part of the so-called red pill movement, pretend to despise feminists, and yet have essentially arrived at the same conclusion as feminists, which is that we should give up on the family. The two sides hate marriage almost as...
Well, that's another misrepresentation off the bat, isn't it? You know, I was on another stream earlier and we were talking about this tendency for tradcon commentators to attempt to smear people in the men's online space by calling them feminists, because they kind of know that for many people that is going to be the worst, most dire insult that can possibly be leveled at them. You're like a feminist. That is the worst possible thing. In their view, in the tradcon's view, that can be leveled against the so-called red pill community. So he's using that as a slur. It's a kind of a shaming tactic. Have the red pill people come to the same conclusion as the feminists? I don't think so. I mean, there's a couple of stretches here. For a start, you'd have to substantiate the notion that the feminists really do want to undermine the family, and I think that is a contentious point, although many won't agree with me. And the other thing is that do people on the other side, do people in the red pill space want to undermine the family? Well, not really, because most people I know and most people I come into contact with and talk to are extremely pro-family. I think Pearl is very pro-family. I think most of the dudes I know, you know, some of the bigger name creators and so on in the space are very, very pro-family. They all either have children or they want to have children or they aspire to bring children into the world. So I think we have to separate marriage from bringing children into the world or having families. Now, what those families will look like, of course, is another question, but it's not quite the same thing.
As much as they hate each other. Now, one of these influencers is a woman named Pearl Davis, who has garnered a relatively large following on YouTube and various social media platforms. She's in her mid-20s, single and childless, and yet full of opinions about modern marriage and family life, a subject that she has no personal insight into whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, that troubles me a little bit. It irritates me a little bit that he says that. Just because somebody is not married and they don't have children, I don't believe that that means that they have no right to any opinion on the subject. I just don't think that that is logically true, and I don't think that that is ethically true. I think it's a bit of a low blow. I think that whether you have children or not, whether you're married or not, you know, none of us live in a bubble. We're all surrounded by friends and family and relatives and people that we know very well who probably are married and probably do have children. We can all see what's going on in society. I think that all of these people who don't have those things can still proffer an intelligent and cogent view on the subject. And I think it's rather reductive to suggest that they...
She spent the past few days on the internet complaining about quote-unquote tradcons like myself, who, she says, promote the nuclear family despite not understanding what it's really like.
I mean, tradcons, I mean, Jesus Christ. Look at Matt Walsh here. He's got the hipster beard. He's got this stupid plaid shirt on, and he's got a bloody banjo behind him. I mean, it's a ridiculous... And this is clearly, you know, he's trying to sort of be down with the guys in the way that he presents himself. And this is clearly a man who is highly educated, who is highly intelligent, highly articulate, who probably has never done a day's work in his life of any kind of manual sorts, is a multimillionaire. And yet he's trying to put on this man of the people kind of air. It doesn't really fly, does it?
Yes, we men who actually have wives and children don't know what it's like to be married, but a woman who is not married and has no children does know what it's like. In one of her tweets, she wrote, quote, "The tradcons push marriage because they aren't old enough to know better. They don't know the reality of what they're pushing." This is accompanied by a picture of myself, Ben Shapiro, Michael Knowles. We aren't old enough to know better and don't know the reality of what we're pushing, yet a woman who is younger than us and single does know better and does understand this reality. Another post, she goes on to say that...
Yeah, okay. Well, he's doubling down now, isn't he? And using Pearl's age, which I think is 26 at the moment, and her status as single against her. So he's trying to shut down her right to have a view on this subject because of those things. But the truth of the matter is that the kernel of her point is correct. Matt Walsh is 37. He's over 10 years younger than me. The other people that he mentioned, I think, are even younger. I forget exactly how long Matt has been married, but I don't think we're not talking multiple decades, as far as I know. I think we're talking a single decade, maybe a bit more. So yeah, of course, he's got experience of being married, right? I mean, nobody can deny that. Nobody would seek to take that away from him. But what he doesn't have, with all due respect, is experience of proper long-term monogamy. And proper long-term monogamy, really, I would say, I mean, look, it's an arbitrary number. I would say we're talking 15 years, we're talking 20 years, we're talking 25 years. Because, and look, I mean, Stephen Crowder, look what happened with him. He was married for a long time. Probably if you'd spoken to him a couple of years ago, he would have been saying exactly the same things as Matt Walsh is saying now. And then look what happened with his marriage, okay? So the problem with marriage, and this is something that I've observed in my own life with friends of mine and people that I know and people in the family, is that it is great until it's not, okay? It's great until it isn't. And the fact that you have been married for 12 years or whatever it is, okay, great, very happy for you, hope it works out, but you still haven't really done the hard yards, okay? You still haven't really, you know, the children are still probably quite young. The children haven't left home yet. That's often a pressure point for people, all right? You know, if they get together, they have children, A lot of people will end up staying together while the children grow up. When the children have left home and you've got that empty nest syndrome, how are things looking then? You know, so that's why she's saying what she's saying, and I think it's a good point. And the fact that she is unmarried is irrelevant.
Marriage is a terrible deal for men. And she later explains, quote, would you ever sign a contract that fails 75% of the time, where your business partner is paid to break the contract? Why would you encourage men to sign that contract until the terms are fixed? Now, you may be surprised to learn that marriages fail at a rate of 75%. The figure that people like this normally use is 50%. And the claim that 50% of marriages end in divorce is already spurious, and we'll have more on that in a moment. But 75%? I was wondering where that number came from, so I scrolled down and I saw something that she reposted from an alleged lawyer who said this, quote, it's not 50-50. That only accounts for divorces. Another 25% on the negative side for miserable men trapped in cheaper to keep her marriages, unwilling to risk financial destruction and loss of their children. 75% chance of a devastatingly bad outcome is just a bad plan. No sane person would enter into a commercial contract on such terms. Now, I did ask him where he got this 75% figure from, and he wouldn't say. Apparently, the magic statistic fairy came and whispered it in his ear.
Well, okay, so the 50% is, I mean, look, we can quibble, and it's going to be different in different geographical areas, territories, but we could all kind of agree 50% is about right for the divorce rate. It's about right. As he says, it's the often quoted statistic. So that's kind of common knowledge. It's kind of accepted. The 25% that this lawyer has added on to talk about unhappy marriages is a spurious figure. We don't know where he got that from. Maybe this guy just made it up. But it will be interesting to find out what that figure is. Because is it really Matt Walsh's contention that the remaining 50% of marriages where people don't get divorced, is it his contention that all of those marriages are blissfully happy? Because if that is his contention, I don't believe it is, that would seem to be foolish. Okay? So clearly there is a proportion of those marriages where people don't get divorced for whatever reason, where it's not happy. Okay? The marriage has not worked as the participants would have liked it to work. It's just that they haven't bothered to get divorced yet. Okay? We don't know the exact size of that proportion, but maybe 25% is, you know, which is 50% of the remaining 50%. Maybe that's not a bad guess. I mean, it's a guesstimate, but I would, you know, this is conjecture, and you can shoot me down for this, but if I was a betting man, I would probably put my money on something like that, to be honest. I don't believe that every marriage out there where the people just don't get divorced because of religion or because of money issues or the children or whatever, they're all blissfully happy. I don't believe that for 1 second. I think there's a lot of very unhappily married people out there. So Matt just rubbishes the whole thing when really the question should be, okay, well, what is that proportion and how do we accurately gauge that proportion?
Now, for her part, Pearl later tweeted a picture of Pierce Brosnan with his wife of 20 years, and she questioned whether the marriage counts as successful since Brosnan's wife has put on some weight at the age of 60. So apparently, even if they're happy and have remained married for 2 decades, they still might fall into that 75% failure rate because they have not both remained in supermodel condition into their 60s.
Yeah.
This debate on social media brought out the rest of the marriage skeptical crowd on the right. A bunch of these red pill influencers decided to hop on an emergency Zoom call and spend 2 hours talking about me and the rest of the Daily Wire crew and our reckless promotion of society's most fundamental institution.
Society's most fundamental institution. I think that's debatable, isn't it, really? I think it's a central social pillar of many countries. Whether it's the most fundamental, I would question that. I would say democracy has got to count for something. I would say the rule of law. I would say the way countries are governed. I would say those things are more fundamental than marriage. I mean, marriage was really a business contract, wasn't it? It was a way of marrying fortunes together. It was a way of saying, okay, here's this landowner owner here, here's this landowner over there. It would be great if we can make a ton of money by putting our fortunes together. So let's get these two married and we'll sign a contract and then everything's good to go. So is that fundamental? I mean, it's a kind of a, it's a central custom in many of our societies, but is it really fundamental to the state? I would question that, really.
Now, there's one clip here that you should see. This is apparently a divorce lawyer who says that the failure rate for marriage is not 50% and it's not 75%. It is, in fact, even higher. Listen.
I think marriage can be successful.
So this is James Sexton, who's a New York divorce lawyer, and this is from Rule Zero. I was actually on this show. This was about a week ago with Rollo and Ryan Stone and the rest of the guys.
Of course. It's just not something that's as scalable as we as a society are trying to pretend it is. Marriage is, and I've said this 100 times and I'll say it 100 more, marriage is like the lottery. You are probably not going to win. Okay? You're probably not going to win. Don't make that your 401k. You're probably not going to win. But if you win, what you win is so great that I don't blame you for buying a ticket and trying. I personally don't buy lottery tickets. But when somebody says, yeah, I played the lottery, hey, man, somebody's got to win. And you know what? As long as you're not blowing money that you need for food or to put shoes on your kids' feet, you're not hurting anybody. Go out, give it a try. So I always tell people, listen, marriage, when it works, when you have somebody who's married 20 plus years and they're still crazy about each other, that is the exception, not the rule. But when you do it, it's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. So why not buy the ticket, take the ride, but have a prenup? Wear a seatbelt, guys. You can be a safe driver, but wear a seatbelt.
Black Lives Matter released their 990 IRS filings. They collected 80 million.
So a happy marriage, he says, is like winning the lottery. And the thing about the lottery is that almost everybody loses. This is a perfect summation of how this entire club views marriage.
Well, it seemed to me that, so what happens now is that Matt picks apart the analogy of marriage being like a lottery, okay? And he pulls that apart and rubbishes it, which we'll see in a second. But he disregards the underlying point, which is that a lot of marriages don't work out very well for the participants. A lot of these marriages do end in divorce, or they end up in an unhappy situation. And in essence, I think what Mr. Sexton is saying holds good. It is a bit of a lottery. You know, you don't know what's going to happen. You're signing on the line that is dotted with this person. And even you may have been with her for many years. You may think you know her inside out, but things still happen, okay, on a long timeline. People change. The way that people react under pressure is somewhat unpredictable, maybe even to themselves. And shit happens. And it really is a bit of a lottery. Now, as I say, well, we'll get into it, but Matt now pulls apart the use of that analogy. But I think slightly unfairly, maybe, because I think we're all colloquially aware of people saying it's a lottery, right? Okay, it doesn't mean that that's a statistical projection. It just means that it's down to luck rather than anything more structured than that.
And the message that they're sending to young men in particular. Sure, it can be great, they concede, but only if you're insanely lucky. Everybody else is screwed. This is a rather bleak view of marriage, and thankfully, it's also nonsense. First of all, the claim that marriage isn't scalable is obviously ridiculous because marriage has served as the bedrock of human society since time immemorial.
So my interpretation of when James Sexton said marriage isn't scalable, I think my interpretation of what he meant was it shouldn't be scalable in the sense that it doesn't work for everybody. So yes, of course, it is scalable in the sense that anybody can do it. It's a legal instrument. If you want to do it, you find a partner who wants to do it with you, and you guys go and you sign the necessary paperwork, and then you've got married. So in that sense, yes, it's scalable because that can be done in pretty much any city in any country in the world. But should it be scalable? That is the question. Should it be open to everybody? Should everybody be doing this? Does it suit everybody? Does it, I'm unmarried in my late 40s. Why is that? Well, because my gut instinct is that marriage probably doesn't suit me as an individual. Should it be scalable to people like me then? Probably not. I'm not that I shouldn't have the option to do it if I wanted to, but should everybody be taking this thing up in the way that they have been in the past?
It has already happened at the scale of civilization for thousands of years. Now, the divorce lawyers come along and say that, this thing that society's been doing forever, turns out it doesn't work.
Well, it doesn't work very well, does it? Otherwise, we wouldn't be having these conversations. I mean, if it worked very well, then there would be no need for Pearl to be talking about it. There will be no need for Matt to make this video, and there will be no need for me to make this reaction video. So the very fact that we're talking about it shows that something is amiss, because if it was great, then nobody would be talking about it. Everyone would just be doing it.
Unless you're the 1 in a million. It's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous claim. Now, what about the failure rate of marriages in our culture? We've heard 50%, we've heard 75%. We just heard that they fail at a rate similar to the rate that people lose the lottery, which would mean higher than 99%, a lot higher. Yet, these kinds of astronomical odds are not based in anything but the doom and gloom speculations of the people inventing them. There is no evidence that having a happy marriage is as unlikely as winning the lottery, or that 75% of marriages end in misery. And what about the 50% number? Well, this is at least is a familiar statistic. It's something.
Well, again, I mean, there is evidence. So he's now going to quibble the 50%. Okay. But that is based in government, statistics. I mean, that stuff has to be logged. So there is evidence for that. As I said before, the additional 25% for unhappiness, that is a more problematic figure. But there is a level of it. Whether it's 25%, we don't know. But there's definitely a lot of unhappy marriages out there, and we can't just pretend that there aren't.
Thing that you've probably heard before: 50% of marriages end in divorce. It's familiar, but it is bogus. And one way you know that it's bogus is that people have been claiming that 50% of marriages end in divorce since I was a kid. I've been.
Well, why does that mean it's bogus?
Hearing that my whole life.
Same with me, but why does that mean it's bogus? I don't understand the logic there.
And that would mean that divorce rates are static across time.
Well, maybe they are.
But of course, that isn't the case. In fact, we know that divorce rates have gone down in recent years.
Well, they've gone down a bit, but then the marriage rate has gone down as well.
So where does the 50% figure come from? Apparently, it's a holdover from the 1980s, which is when people.
It's gone down slightly, but it hasn't gone down substantially. And also the marriage rate has fallen as well. So he's being a little bit disingenuous there, I think.
First started citing that statistic. It's not true today.
Well, it's more or less true.
It's actually not clear.
And also it depends as well what territories you're looking at. Are you looking globally? Are you just looking US? Are you looking UK, US? Are you looking Anglosphere? Are you looking, there's so many different ways of dicing this up, but around 50% is a pretty good yardstick.
That it was true even in the 80s either. So what is the actual divorce rate? It's a little bit hard to determine. Probably our best guess is based on U.S. Census data, which according to the most recent figures, says that about 35% of American adults who have been married have been divorced. So it's not exactly going to give us a precisely scientific figure of what the divorce rate is, but it's as close as we're going to get, 35%. And 35% is high.
In what time period? Did he say? People that have been married.
So it's not exactly going to give us a precisely scientific figure of, and it's actually not clear that it was true even in the 80s either. So what is the actual divorce rate? It's a little bit hard to determine. Probably our best guess is based on U.S. Census data, which according to the most recent figures says that about 35% of American adults who have been married have been divorced. So it's not exactly going to give us a precisely scientific figure of what the divorce rate is, but it's as close as we're going to get, 35%. And 35% is high. I mean, it's way too high. It's not 50%, though. And it's not 75%. And it's not 99%. And it's definitely not lottery odds. Still, isn't it terrifying to think that if you get married, your chance of failure is 35%, and the chance of success is only 65% at the most? Even if we go with that number, isn't that still very, very scary?
Well, given the laws around what happens after a divorce, and particularly the laws regarding children and alimony and ability to see one's children and all that kind of thing, it is pretty scary.
Isn't it high enough that it should dissuade anyone from attempting it? The answer to that question is no.
And here we go with the stirring rhetoric.
And here's why. If the divorce rate is 35%, or even if it's 50%, it does not follow that your own particular marriage has a 35 or 50% chance of failure. Now, I'm not saying that you should be cocky or reckless, or that you should see yourself as invincible. I am saying that you shouldn't, on the other extreme, see yourself as passive debris floating helplessly on the tide of statistical likelihoods. Because you are an individual. Your marriage is an individual thing. And its chances of failure are not set by society at large. So here's an example to illustrate what I mean. And this is really, really important to understand because as marriage rates fall, and those are falling, the thing that convinces so many people to not marry in the first place are numbers like this. And this misconception that, well, look at the divorce rate, and that is my own specific chance of getting divorced. And I'm here to tell you that that's not how it works. Well, you know a company's looking out for you when they actually upgrade your service and don't charge you for it. This is great news for new and 5G network in America. Remember, Americans, buy America.
I love everything that you've done.
The brand, the design, the name.
Does that mean that your own chances of becoming obese are 40%? No, it doesn't.
We might have missed a little bit there, but basically he's talking about the rate of obesity in America, and he's likening that to the rate of divorce. And he's saying, just because 40% of Americans are obese, does that mean that you've got a 40% chance of becoming obese? The problem with this argument, and there's a glaring issue with this, is that being obese is largely down to individual choices that you make as an individual person, what you put into your body, the amount of exercise you do. A marriage is different, substantially different, in that there's two people involved. So it's not just what you do in the marriage that's going to affect the likely outcome of that marriage one way or the other. It's also, well, 50% dictated by what the other person does. And the problem that we've got is that you could do everything right in your marriage, whatever that means, but you could do everything right, and the marriage could still fail because of a choice that the other person makes. So to liken it to something like obesity, where actually that is much more in an individual's control, I think is slightly... It doesn't work very well, to put it mildly.
Your chances might be 5%. They might be practically zero, or they might be quite a bit higher than 40%. That's because obesity is the result of behavior and choices.
Right, but individual behavior and choices. The success of a marriage is a joint effort between two people. And if one of those people decides to check out, then it's kind of tough luck on the other, regardless of if he did everything right or not.
If you do not engage in the behavior or make the choices that lead to obesity, you will not become obese. The fact that 40% of people around you are fat does not mean that you automatically have a 40% obesity risk. Now let's take another example. Car accidents. Americans get into car accidents at a certain rate. I'm not sure what the rate is. It doesn't matter for our purposes. What does matter is that your own individual chance of getting into a car accident is not the same as every other driver on the road. The people who compile statistics will say things like, motorists have an X% chance of getting into a collision. But you are not just a generic motorist. You are an individual. Now, you can never bring your...
Okay, so this analogy is slightly better because at least this acknowledges that there are other people involved.
Your own chance of dying in a fiery car wreck down to zero. But if you're a responsible driver, then obviously your chances of getting into an accident are much lower than the chances of someone who...
This is just qualitatively different, isn't it? How is it different? Well, if you are a responsible driver, okay, if you follow the rules of the road, if you are cautious and careful and you don't do anything reckless, then yes, he's right. You're more likely to not end up in an accident than if you are a reckless driver who does stupid things. So that holds good. Is that exactly the same as a marriage? I don't think it is, because a marriage is an emotional bond, and it's an emotional connection between two people, essentially, at root. And if you want to just take one way of looking at this, if you are the analog of the careful driver in your marriage, so you are the good guy, you do everything right, you pay the mortgage on time, you give her everything she wants, you look after the house, you do chores at the weekend, etc., etc. You're doing everything right, but she still may dump you because she thinks you're a boring fuck. Okay? So being the careful driver in a marriage is not a guarantee of success. And I think the qualitative difference is based around emotion, because emotion is a key driver. And maybe people like Matt might claim that it isn't, or it shouldn't be, and that's open to debate, but it is, because Men and women are emotional. Women in particular are emotional, and they will make decisions based on emotion. So you could be doing, as I say, you could be doing all of these things correctly. You could be cleaning the house every weekend. You could be doing your job, working really hard, blah, blah, blah. But you're not giving her the excitement that she wants anymore. And so then she goes off with the pool boy. Okay. So it's very difficult in the context of a marriage to know what is the right behavior to be doing or not. Okay. Particularly if you're a bit of somebody who's not very experienced, let's say, with women in relationships. There are a lot of pitfalls that you can fall into, and you think that you're being the careful driver, but actually it still all goes horribly wrong.
Who is not responsible? All of those stupid drivers who don't understand the basic rules of the road and like to tweet and eat while they drive and everything else, they're inflating the numbers for everyone. They're also making the roads more dangerous for everyone. You know, they are actually actively making your own chances of getting into a car accident higher because the roads are filled with stupid people. But your chances are not as high as their chances. You do not share their level of risk unless you're as dumb as they are. Because again, you are an individual, not a mere statistic. So,
but you're not in a marriage. You're in a couple, and there's two of you, and that changes things substantially.
What about marriage? It's true that even if you do everything right, things can still fall apart if your spouse doesn't follow that program.
Thank you.
Now, if you both do everything right, or even most things right, then your chance of divorce is basically zero. But you can do everything on your end, and maybe your spouse doesn't do the same, and then it falls apart anyway, and that
exactly
happens, and it's terrible, but it happens. It's also true that there are many, many things you can do in your marriage and before your marriage to make it much more secure than the average. Obvious things. Like you can marry someone who shares your same fundamental values. Not everyone does that.
Yeah, okay. But this is where, when you look at the statistics, I think Pearl pulled up a statistic that said that people who married from the same faith, or people in the same church who married, the divorce statistic was still something like 1 in 4. So, and this is well, we'll see what he says now, but this is getting into the sort of basically find a good girl, find somebody who's not going to do the dirty on you, which is a nice idea and it sounds good. But in reality, as I say, it's not like that. It's very hard to adequately vet somebody prior to getting into a relationship with them. It's a very, very hard thing to do because you don't know how they're going to act under pressure in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time. What if you get ill? What if you lose your job? What if there's a massive recession? And there's so many different things that could happen. How's she going to react? Is she going to stay with you through thick and thin? You kind of think so at the beginning, otherwise you wouldn't marry her. But do you really know? Probably not. Again, look what happened with Stephen Crowder.
In fact, a lot of people don't. A lot of people go into marriages knowing ahead of time that they're marrying someone who doesn't share their fundamental values. Their chances of divorce are going to be somewhere much higher than yours.
Well, that's pretty stupid. I mean, obviously, if you're going to marry somebody, you should try and make sure that you're basically on the same page. I mean, that's one reasonable piece of advice.
If you don't make that basic entry-level mistake that they have made, you can do other things. Like you can state from the outset that you both in principle don't believe in divorce and won't consider it as a viable option for solving any marital difficulties you may experience down the line.
Yeah, well.
You can have a strong and shared faith. You can establish from the
well, as I said, faith isn't necessarily going to save you.
Beginning a habit of honest communication. You can make time for each other.
Maybe. But communication relationships is not very sexy, really. What women want, in my view, is somebody who gets it. Okay? I mean, yeah, of course you can talk to her. You want to talk and you want to, whatever. But in the end, I mean, you can't, if you're sitting there asking her what she wants and then trying to deliver what she says in response to that, then you're already losing, because what she's really looking for is somebody who just gets it. But of course, it's very difficult to just get it because you're not a mind reader. So this is one of the problems with long-term relationships.
You can continue to date, even or especially as your lives get busier and you start having kids and so on.
Yeah, date nights. Yeah.
You can make a strong effort to be patient with and grateful to each other. You can take care of your body and your appearance. You can do all these things. And
yeah, so you can do all these things, but again, the other person has got to sign up for it as well. So I suppose The caveat he would make would be, well, you've already pre-vetted her and she's somebody who's on the same page as you and you've made these agreements prior to the marriage, so it's going to be great. But, well, good luck with that is all I can say. I mean, yeah, it might work out for you and fantastic, but I think that people are always on their best behavior early on in relationships because they want to show the best side of themselves, obviously. They want to, you know, show that they're good people and everything else. Are they really going to maintain what they said at the beginning when you're in the honeymoon phase, when things get difficult 5 years later? Not always. Not always.
And more. Now, I'm not saying that if you do all of this, it will bring your divorce chance down to zero. I'm not denying that there are plenty of people out there who did all this, at least on their own end, and yet still ended up divorced. That's not my point. My point is that the divorce rate doesn't take any of that into account. The people who take none of these basic steps are lumped in with the people who do all of it, and we're supposed to believe that both groups have an equal chance of marital failure. That's just not true. Now,
if I had to guess, though, I would say that the second group, which is the group that has done everything very, very carefully, and they're really on the same page, and they're from the same faith and group and all the rest of it, I would imagine that's a very small group of people. I would say the majority of people probably fall into the former group to varying degrees. I'm not saying that all of those people would have just recklessly married somebody who's clearly absolutely wrong for them. But I think I think a lot of the time people fall in love and they get married, and it's a sort of they go on gut instinct. You know, I've been with this person for 2 or 3 years. I think she's great. I think we get on really well. I can see this working, and you kind of go with that. But whether you were right or not is another matter because, well, love is blind, you know, and we can all ignore, I'm afraid, a lot of red flags early on, particularly when emotions get involved. And I think a lot of guys do this. I think a lot of guys actually do ignore, and maybe I'm kind of agreeing with Matt here a little bit, because I think a lot of guys do ignore red flags that really, in hindsight, they should have taken into account and perhaps shouldn't have married that woman in the first place. But look, I mean, this is just the human condition. This is just what we do. It's very easy to sit behind a desk and intellectualize it, but to actually get people to change their behavior and make it this methodical, thoughtful process is very hard, if not impossible.
I don't deny that there are real serious problems with marriage in our society. The so-called red pill people and others, they raise totally legitimate and important points on that end. We need drastic reform, abolish no-fault divorce. The entire family court system has to be torn down and rebuilt. The system is stacked against men in many ways that are extremely unfair and have ruined countless lives. So let's fight for those reforms, absolutely. But this systemic problem...
He should fight for the reforms. He should fight for the reforms. And this is something that Pearl said. I mean, the Daily Wire obviously is a big organization. They're very influential. These guys have got a very big platform. At the very least, they should be fighting for and raising the issues, raising awareness of these issues, because it's undeniable that a lot of men are getting screwed over through divorce, and particularly in regard to parental situations, you know, not being able to see the children, not getting any access at all to their own kids after a divorce has happened. I mean, horrendous, horrendous stories. It clearly needs to be looked at. And really, that's probably where it would be more profitable for Matt to place his attention.
Is not going to be solved today or tomorrow or next week. Abolishing no-fault divorce is just the beginning of reforming the system. Lawmakers in a small number of red states have only just started to seriously consider that idea, which is merely step one.
I think he's right about this, though. I think the problem is, yes, reform is undoubtedly needed, but it is going to take time. It really is going to take time. I don't think it is. I don't think it can be this. I mean, it should be, really. It should, theoretically, it should just be this kind of like, oh, that's a bit shit. Okay, let's change it. But of course, that's not really how the process works. So he's right in the sense that it is going to take time.
So we're a long way off from fixing the system. It took decades to get us here. It will take decades to get us out at best. Anyone who tells you anything else is selling you something. They're selling you a bill of goods. This is a decade-long, long-term struggle. The question is, what are young men, young people in general, supposed to do in the meantime? And this is where the red pill becomes more of a hazy, foggy, ambiguous pill. They have no answer. They simply shout about reforms that are needed, yet have nothing to say to the young men in our culture today who will be old, if not dead, by the time the system is fixed, if it's ever fixed at all. What are these young men supposed to do right now? What kind of life would you have them lead right now?
Well,
today.
They could get a passport and get on a bunch of train and go traveling and have a great time.
The answer, it appears, is that an entire generation of young men, if not multiple generations, should skip marriage while we wait for the system to improve. But this is not a viable solution. It's not a solution at all. It's a surrender.
Well, it is a solution. It might not be a solution that you like, but it is a solution. And I think this needs really to come down to the individual. Okay, I think, and this is my view on the whole marriage thing in summary, really. I think that as an individual, you have to make that choice for yourself. And it's got to be based on a number of things. The first thing has got to be an awareness of the realities of the legal situation that you're signing up to. And obviously that's going to be slightly different depending on where you're based. If you're in the UK, if you're in California versus Florida, that's going to be different, for example, whatever. So you've got to find out what the actual legal ramifications of this are. And if you split, what's going to happen. And you need to think about things like prenups and so on and so forth. So that's one thing. I think you've also got to think about, well, as a guy, what do I actually want? Do I actually want, really, in the depths of my soul, to get into a long-term, a lifelong monogamous contract to one woman that I can't get out of without fairly dire consequences, even if she just changes her mind 5 years down the line? I think you've got to think seriously about those things. Now, the answer might even then be yes, absolutely, I do want to do it. And if so, that's fine. But I think you need to have an informed decision. And I think guys should also be aware that a lot of the scaremongering that gets spread around about being a lonely old man and, oh, you're going to die alone and what about your legacy and all that, a lot of that is just absolute nonsense, okay? There's no reason in 2023 going into 2024 for somebody to be lonely, even as an older guy. You know, we've got the whole internet. You've got a whole planet of people out there. There are people out there who are like-minded that you can meet, that you can connect with. You can have an amazing life as an older guy. I'm in my 40s, but I know guys in their 50s and 60s who are traveling around and having fantastic dating lives and just a great time anyway. And they're not dealing with, or they have dealt with previously, they've been through divorce and now they're out the other side, and they're not dealing with all of this nonsense that we're talking about here. So there really is another way. If you don't want to have to deal with all this crap, there really is another way. But on the other hand, you know, you meet somebody and you want to make that formal, you want to make that into, you know, you want to do the marriage thing and you want to make this into a, you know, that your status to be married, then you should do that. But you should be well informed and you should go in with your eyes open.
You're asking entire generations to give up their bloodline, their legacy, their chance of finding the truth.
Well, not necessarily, because again, he's conflating marriage with having children. And the two things aren't necessarily the same, because I know plenty of dudes who are not married and who don't want to get married, who have children or are planning to have children, okay? You don't have to be married to have kids.
Transcendent joy and meaning that family life can provide. You're asking them to give up on themselves and on civilization itself. For thousands of years, human beings have always understood their most basic purpose and obligation.
I mean, look, call me a degenerate, but I don't think civilization will fail if marriage in the end gets phased out. I think what will happen instead is that we will start to organize ourselves in a slightly different way. Maybe, and maybe it'll just come down to the legal status of marriage. Maybe, you know, enough guys will turn against marriage and be like, well, this is clearly a bit of a raw deal, so fewer guys will do it. They'll probably still cohabitate with women. They'll probably still be in long-term relationships with women. I don't think this is the end of times. I just think that it's a transitional period, because clearly there's something wrong, at the very least, in the legal status of marriage, if not in the very concept of lifelong monogamy. And, you know, it might be, and I've seen commentators saying this, that we might be moving towards more of a serial monogamy society where you're with a partner for a period of time and then you leave that relationship and then you go on to somebody else. I don't say that with any joy, because I think that's actually quite a sad way to live, really. But it could be that we're moving more towards that model. I don't think that the walls are going to fall in. I don't think that the earth is going to blow up. I think it's a transitional period, as with all of these things. I mean, nothing is forever. Just because marriage has been around in one form or another for many hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, does it have to be forever? Not really. We'll just find another way to organize ourselves.
Obligation was to form families and have children. And yet...
Right, okay. Well, but you can still have children.
You're telling these young men to ignore this calling and do what instead? Live for themselves alone?
Party, Cancun.
Wasting away in front of screens? Only to die with no descendants, leaving no lasting mark on the world?
Oh, Jesus Christ. I mean, I haven't even got time to go into the legacy argument here, but it is bollocks. The reality is that even if you have kids, your legacy, the mark on the world that you leave, is going to last for a generation, at the very most, a couple of generations, and nobody's going to remember you after that. Nobody gives a damn, okay? And in the vast majority of cases, most people are ordinary people, okay? And they're going to have kids, and those kids are going to be ordinary people who are going to be probably good and loyal and wonderful human beings who just do normal work and get married themselves and procreate and then die. And nothing remarkable is going to happen, okay? Leaving a mark on the earth is vanity, really, you know? Because nobody gives a damn about 99.9% of the people on this planet. Nobody cares. You're here for a while. You're going to die. Everyone's going to forget about you. And in the end, the planet itself is going to be destroyed. Humanity will be destroyed. And that'll be it. And it'll be like none of this ever existed. So the whole notion, and I think it's actually a very selfish way to think about bringing children into the world, to think about legacy and, oh, am I going to leave a mark? Because as I say, all of that is ego. All of that is your own ego. And I think that's a bad reason to bring another human life into being because of basically your own ego. I think it's just not the right way to operate.
Think about the kind of misery you're consigning these men to. Think about the catastrophic, probably fatal effect this would have on our country.
Well, I mean, it could be quite good because actually a lot of married people are miserable as well. So, you know, these dudes could just go to Mexico and party, you know? It's not all doom and gloom, Matt.
You can't give up on propagating the species for a few decades and then pick it back up again like nothing happened.
It's not propagating the species. We're talking about marriage. Jesus Christ, man.
That doesn't work on any level, individually or societally. It is a recipe for despair and collapse.
Well, you could say marriages as well.
Saying that young men and women should accept the risk then and get married anyway? Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. That doesn't mean you should be reckless. I've already talked about many practical things you can do to mitigate your own risk so that it's not a roll of the dice. You should do all those things. Don't go.
Well, it wasn't a bad stab at a list of things, but it wasn't bulletproof by any means, let's be honest. And even he conceded that it wasn't bulletproof.
Go into marriage blind, but don't run from it either. Even if you mitigate the risk to the extent possible, still there will be a risk. That's true. But here's the rub. All good things come with risk. The more worthwhile it is, the worse and more disastrous it will be if you fail. If you take on more responsibility, then your life will be more consequential. And the more consequential your life is, the more cataclysmic your failures potentially become. A married man with children lives a life of greater consequence than a single man with no children.
I suppose so. In the sense that he is responsible for more people. But again, I mean, how are you really measuring this? How is consequential measured? He has meaning to his whatever children he has, whatever offspring he has. But then what if the person without children, I mean, well, she was a woman, but Theresa May was the Prime Minister of Britain, and she has no children. Is she less consequential than somebody who's living in Luton because they've got a few kids? I mean, many would say more consequential. So it depends how you're measuring this stuff, really. But I would challenge his premise there.
There are more people depending on him. He has a greater stake in the future.
Well, not if you're Theresa May.
This means that if things go sideways, it'll be a tragedy. If he screws up or his wife screws up or they both do, his life will be ruined, his children will be devastated, and the impact will reverberate down through the generations. This is what it means.
Well, come on. It'll reverberate for a bit. I mean, Jesus Christ. I mean, look, lots of things have happened in my family. My parents were divorced when I was quite young and so on and so forth. Is that going to reverberate down the generations? Is it? Fuck. I mean, nobody remembers it now. It's, you know, there's a lot of hyperbole here, I think, which is not really realistic.
It means to live a high impact, consequential life.
It just annoys me a bit. I think that you can live a high impact, consequential life and not have children. Now, look, I'm not being some kind of anti-natalist here. Do what you want to do. But I think that it's just disingenuous to claim that the only way that you can have a consequential life is to have a couple of kids. Because if you go out there into the street and look at the people who've got kids, I'm not being rude, but I mean, the bar is not very high. Let's put it that way. So it's not as if you're joining some kind of elite club of superhumans.
These are the stakes. And yes, they are quite high. Now, sure, you can stave off that sort of catastrophe by staying by yourself, never going out on a limb, never taking any risk, never marrying, never having kids, never striving for anything great or meaningful in life.
Well, what if you strive for something that's great and meaningful in life that doesn't involve family? What about your faith, Matt Walsh? Does your faith count for nothing? Isn't that great and meaningful? Again, there seems to be a lot of ego here, which is coming through.
But then you're not avoiding failure and misery. You are guaranteeing it. You are ensuring that
not necessarily.
You never lose your family in a divorce by never having a family to lose in the first place, which is like ensuring that you never go bankrupt by being bankrupt to begin with. I'm not going to lose all my money.
I mean, look, when he's presenting this as a series of sort of either or, as a sort of dichotomy, isn't he? You know, if you don't man up and take a risk, then you're not going to have the wonderful joy that you could otherwise have had by having a family. But that, and again, he kind of concedes it from time to time, but the underlying supposition here is that basically if you have a family, that's going to be fucking amazing, it's going to be great, and you're going to be happy or at least fulfilled or whatever. And that is just not necessarily true, unfortunately. I'm sorry to be the harbinger of bad tidings, but it just isn't true all of the time. And it may not even be true a majority of the time, to be honest. So, you know, and whereas conceivably you could have the dude who's single, who's, you know, traveling around, who's living a great lifestyle, who is happier than the guy who is married and who's, you know, over leveraged himself and has a big mortgage to pay and a, you know, terrible boss and screaming kids and a screaming wife. So he presents it very rhetorically skilled. He's rhetorically skilled in the way that he presents this stuff, but it doesn't necessarily reflect reality.
Because I'm going to stay broke. I beat the system. Not losing by having nothing to lose is a loss in itself. And I don't.
You see, he presents now not being married as losing. But is that correct? I would question that.
I don't want that for anyone. It's not a path to happiness and prosperity for either you or society. It is a path to defeat, a preemptive and self-imposed defeat. And that is the worst kind of all. Hey, YouTube, thank you.
Well, there you go. Beautiful stuff. Again, you know, he is clearly... he's a good speaker. It looks like that was scripted. He's a good speaker. He's eloquent. He is rhetorically gifted, so he's able to make this stuff sound good. But does all of it stand up to scrutiny? Does all of it stand up to logic? Not really, no. It doesn't really pass the reality test, because you've only got to walk out of the flat or the apartment or the house or wherever you are and have a look around, and you'll see that, you know, the people that have kids aren't these universally happy, wonderfully joyful people, or the people that are married aren't these wonderfully joyful people the whole time. Actually, a lot of them are pretty miserable. A lot of them probably wish they were on a beach in Mexico, and maybe a lot of them regret their decision. I'm sure a lot of them don't as well, and I'm not denying that, obviously, you know, having kids specifically is probably the most wonderful thing that a human being can do. But is that the only thing that can make your life consequential? I don't believe that it is by any means. But anyway, I mean, as I say, the whole thing about bringing children into this is a bit of a red herring, because we're not really talking about children here. We're talking about marriage. And marriage clearly is extremely problematic, particularly if you're a dude, because you've got to sign a contract that may end up with you getting completely screwed over in the court system and not being able to see your children. And many men end up on the verge of suicide, or actually committing suicide as a result of that. And the other thing is, it kind of flies in the face of your nature anyway, because most, you know, the reality is most guys really, they like novelty, they like variety, okay? And when you get married to somebody, and it's a monogamous marriage, it's a conventional monogamous marriage, you make a choice to forego that for your wife. Now, that's fair enough. And if you want to do that, that's absolutely fine. But you are somewhat going against your nature, even as an older guy. So you've got to bear that in mind when you look to get married and when you sign that contract, okay? Anyway, hope you enjoyed that. Hope you got something out of that. Comments below. Let me know what you think. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, then please do that. Link is below. If you want to get on a free call with me to discuss any of these issues or your own dating life, again, link is below. I'll see you guys again very soon. Bye-bye.